Welcome back to Analysis, where we're discussing the rise in honour killing and violence across the world against women. In this half of the programme, we'll be talking about the prevalence of violence towards women both at home and abroad, and talking about the ways in which it can be prevented, hopefully. Joining me in the studio are Zara Faris, a writer and Muslim activist, Aina Khan, solicitor and head of Islamic and Asian department at Duncan Lewis Solicitors, and Rennie Eder-Lodge, a writer and contributing editor to the Feminist Times. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Rennie. I mean, do you think that this focus on so-called honour killings is diverting attention from the much wider issue of domestic violence of all kinds against women?
I think it's all part and parcel of the same patriarchy. This is about violence against women, and it doesn't. I think it's symptomatic of the same problem wherever it happens. I do think that in the UK we have a nasty habit of pointing to countries abroad and saying the problem is worse over there, but actually violence against women crosses class, it crosses country, it crosses all boundaries. So many women are subject to violence against them because they are women.
And Aina Khan, I mean, do you think there is a sort of the media spotlight is somehow unfairly directed at honour killings when we should be talking about the much wider issue that Rennie's mentioning?
Exactly. If we strip it right down, it's murder and it's violence and it's an abuse of the human rights of the individual. So whether it's against women or men, I would say we should have zero tolerance of that, first of all. So to start giving it labels somehow makes it seem acceptable, because if it's an honour crime, it must be the culture that led to it, so perhaps we should understand. We don't need to understand. It's just got to stop. And if we can say full stop to it on that basis, I think we would really be helping the communities that we live in.
But when it comes to these family crimes, which the honour killing usually is, isn't it a wider, different issue from violence against women? It's about property. I mean, it's about treating a woman as a sort of commodity that belongs to somebody else rather than a person who has her own individuality and her own rights and dignity.
I think it's a sort of a mistake to say that this is a result of patriarchy and to focus on the fact that it happens to women. Yes, it's terrible and it happens to women. However, violence itself has become so prevalent in cultures all over the world. And when we look at the issue on a one-sided basis and we only look at the problems that women are facing, we're going to come up with one-sided solutions that don't actually deal with the problems in society at a root level. So, for example, violence against women, yes, it happens, it is terrible. However, violence also happens against men, it happens against children, it happens against all people in society. So why, my question is, are we focusing only on violence against women?
Because of accountability, isn't it? Isn't it that, I mean, you're a lawyer, isn't it? Because the law doesn't, up till now, hasn't been treating domestic abuse, which is mainly men against women rather than the opposite, something that's less important than other kinds of violence like in the street or between strangers, isn't it?
It comes down to the figures in the end. The data shows that women are the majority of the victims. Yes, men are coming forward more now, so the incidence of domestic abuse against men is now documented more. However, it's still, I think, always going to be the case that women will come off worst, simply because physically we are weaker than men, and that's been used to subjugate women for millennia, and it will carry on until our justice system gives us equal rights. And that's why I say to you, when you've got on a program called Islam Channel, and Islam has given women those rights, then why on earth are we not, as Muslims, making sure those rights are protected? How can we then go back to a pre-Islamic era where women particularly were treated as of no worth, with no value, bought and sold, like you said? Islam gave them the right to keep their own name, their own property, their own earnings, education, etc. Where did all that go? Is it that the culture hijacks the faith in these cases?
Well, Rennie, would you come in on this?
Well, violence is about power, and we can't fool ourselves that we live in an equal society. We don't all stand in parity with each other, and you only have to look at what power looks like in communities across the world to draw that conclusion. And unfortunately, women are still socially and financially disenfranchised. There are still many, many women across the world who are financially dependent on men. Many, many women across the world who find themselves in situations because they're financially dependent on men, and this happens in the UK as well as everywhere else. They have to put up with coercive, abusive situations because they find themselves being a dependent, much like their children are dependents on them. So when we live in a society that is not equal, that still discriminates on the basis of gender, to so many people, we have to look at how power manifests to stop people from accessing power. And violence is one of the biggest ways to stop people from standing independently, from being free, from being liberated and to access power. So there's gendered inequality across the world, and it goes it's not just about gender, it's about race, it's about disability, it's about sexuality. There's lots of different ways that people are oppressed because of their identity.
Sarah.
Could I chime in there? So I'm quite shocked by the idea that somehow it should be a numbers game, that we have to wait until it's 50-50 before we take violence generally seriously when it occurs with men as well as women. Islam does not discriminate or consider the victim's gender. It just looks at the injustice that is occurring and it seeks to repair that, regardless of the gender of the person. I don't think we should wait for, a 50% quota of male victims or female victims before we deal with the problem. And you mentioned earlier accountability, and it is correct that accountability is not available for either women who seek that kind of violence or injustice, but also men. And in terms of, for example, domestic violence statistics, some have published statistics, including the British Crime Survey, that show that actually the statistics would reveal that men and women almost equally. I think men, the last time they did the statistics, they found that men were actually victims of domestic violence in around 40% of cases. But the reason we sideline that issue is because we are not used to hearing about it. And we also don't have that kind of gravity of movement that exists with, for example, women's rights movements to raise awareness about those issues. The difference with Islam is that we don't, as I mentioned, look at only one section of the community. We don't look at one problem. We try to look at the problems in society comprehensively so that we don't just apply sort of band-aid solutions. I think many of the projects that are being done, for example, by or the work that is being done by refuges for men and women, it's excellent and it's a necessary tool to deal with the current situations that we are facing. However, again, they don't deal with the root problem that is existence in society. And just to maybe, if I could suggest what that root problem may be, very briefly, I think essentially men and women are essentially unaware of what not just their rights but their duties, their rights and duties should be towards one another. So they should be balanced. So where somebody has a right or a privilege, it should be tempered by accountability and responsibility. And similarly, where women have rights and privileges, such as the right to be provided for if they are in that situation, and if they are divorced, the right to alimony and sustenance thereafter, is also tempered by certain responsibilities and duties as well. I think in today's society where we don't have that understanding, it gives rise to these frustrating, anarchic situations that result in what we're seeing today.
Well, I would like to comment on that because we have legal mechanisms in place which are completely compliant under English law and Sharia law. So I specialise in Sharia family law under English law, which means that my clients, male and female, if they suffer violence or their children are at risk of violence, they don't need to feel that for the sake of the honour of the community, they have to hide that. In fact, it's a duty to safeguard that family. So under Islam, they would know it's their duty to speak up, get to a place of safety, then work on the anger management and the therapy that the family needs, then try and reconcile their issues. And if there's capacity for change amongst that couple, then they can live together again. But instead of burying it deep and thinking it will go away, this is like a plaster on a boil. That boil has to be lanced.
But Britain has changed the rules on the law, in fact, on honour killings, hasn't it? On the police practices have changed. Has that made any improvement?
Not recently, no, it hasn't. For example, the guidance for GPs is still appalling, that they are not even aware that you shouldn't speak to an honour violence victim, because obviously she's just come to you to complain about domestic violence. If she can't speak English, they're often asking the family to translate. And they have to be very, very careful. So there are guidelines which we all have to follow, which mean just be aware of the risks to the victim, take her separately and ask certain questions. And there are ways to analyse the risk very discreetly. So we've got all those systems in place, that what happens with the Muslim community is there's such a shame and honour issue going on all the time. You've got professional women and men, extremely well-off women and men, hiding that they have a dysfunctional family life. And it's really important that in Islam we have what we call sakoon and peace at home, because we are raising children in that environment who have to grow up as good human beings. So actually it's a service to our community to recognise it.
Well, Renia, do you see any sign of improvement over the last few years, now that these issues have become a bit more prominent in the media?
I don't know if I've seen improvement, because there are still a shocking amount of women who just every year who are killed by their partners, and when they're reporting it to the police don't take the problem seriously, because because the factors that allow women to find themselves in abusive relationships are almost seen as the norm and not something to rectify in the first place. So financial disenfranchisement, etc., the way that changes to the benefit system actually detract from women's financial independence, so that it makes it harder for women to be able to leave abusive relationships. None of those things have really been looked at in a joined up sort of manner. So I think that the issue is becoming more prominent, but I think that we have a long way to go. And actually, I'd like to push back on this sort of idea that by focusing on the vast majority of people who are victims of domestic violence, which are female, and Women's Aid's stats, Women's Aid's the charity that focuses on these issues, stats say that men do suffer from domestic violence, but women suffer from domestic violence at much higher rates. I don't think that by saying that the vast majority of victims of this crime are female somehow discounts the experiences of men. Like, I think that by lifting shame around the issue, that helps everybody who's affected by the issues, and not just the people who are actually on the receiving end of the violence, but the people who are in the household in which the violence occurs, which are children, you know, because it's so damaging for children to grow up in a household where they see their parents hitting each other. So I don't think by focusing on X means that we discount Y. But unfortunately, the scales aren't levelled here. The scales are wildly imbalanced. And whilst we still live in a society that is structurally unequal and that is structurally sexist, the scales will be unbalanced. We also need to, I'm going on and on here, but start picking apart exactly what it means to be masculine and to be feminine, because unfortunately, as long as we equate femininity with submissiveness and, you know, not wanting to bring shame, etc., etc., and as long as we equate masculinity with being dominant and being the king of the household, these situations will continue to happen.
That's an excellent point, but we'll just have to take another short break. So please do stay tuned in for more in-depth discussion on this subject towards women, violence towards women across the world.
That's actually the essence of it.
Yeah. No. All right, we'll stop. Welcome back to Analysis. Well, Aina Khan, how do you react to that point that Renia just made about masculinity and femininity?
I think that's at the core of this debate. And when we look at notions of being a woman means to be feminine and submissive, which is a cultural and Muslim, it seems, notion, and that men are manly and masculine if they're in charge of their family and in control and have the position of power. If you look at the reality of Islam, it will shock a lot of people, because if we follow the guidance of our Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, did he ever lift a hand towards anyone? No. Not a woman, not a child. In fact, he spoke forcefully against any form of violence, that a human being is above that, and they don't behave like that. Women, on the other hand, were very feminist, if you want to call it that. Not in a sense of women are more important than men. That's not what feminism means. But they have equal worth to men. And the Islamic women, the early Muslim women, were strong-minded. They used to challenge the Caliph if he was wrong. Hazrat Umar said, a woman is right and the Caliph is wrong. How was that possible if women's voices couldn't be heard in public? Of course it was possible, and it was there and documented to tell us that we should have our voices heard. We are of equal worth, and don't let anyone take that away from you. It's only when women don't know their own worth that men can get away with this.
Well, do you think it will help if, in Britain particularly, the law was changed so that the phrase honour killings was used in law rather than just the idea of murder, so that it would highlight the problem and perhaps families would come forward and say, look, things are going on in our family that need to be addressed?
I'm not sure if that's not a red herring. It might detract from the whole situation if you make it an honour killing, so then it becomes an Asian or a Muslim issue. And again, we're trying to understand the culture. As I said earlier, I really think we need to call it murder, domestic violence, rape, or whatever the crime is. Try and understand motivation if there's a reasoning behind it, but there's no need to label it.
What's your line on labelling? Good idea or bad idea?
I think it is a bad idea, and even if you look at the way that the incident in Lahore was reported in the media, initially a lot of the newspapers were describing it as a stoning offence, just to sort of give it that ritualistic angle, which it wasn't the case at all. Unfortunately, the gory details are that she was bludgeoned with bricks and all kinds of things. There's nothing to do with stoning or any kind of Islamic kind of, even a hint of Islamic sort of ritual there. But I also would like to come back to the point about, I do think it's a valid point to make that it really isn't a numbers game. And I'm glad you agree, Renee, that, violence against men is not, the issue is not detracted just by mentioning violence against women. However, my point is that activism then should also be equally focused on both situations in order to be truly just and to truly be consistent in the principles that we claim to advocate. And I think that the Islamic system or the Islamic mode of dealing with these situations is it doesn't look at masculinity or femininity. It considers men and women to be the same. Their ability to think is the same. Their ability to live life and their sort of their vitality for life is the same. The only situations in which it addresses them differently is in those situations in which their bodily functions may be different. But other than that, it's not. I don't think it is just to look at the issue as what is masculine and what is feminine, because not all people fit into those boxes.
The harsh reality is the funding, government funding, is only available at the moment for two things: radicalism and women's subjugation. So sadly, if it's a matter of resources, you have to tick those two boxes to get anywhere.
Let me ask you.
That's the reality.
We're coming a bit towards the end of the programme. Time is not very long, although I've got quite a big question I wanted to ask you, which is, because you represent feminist times and write for them. Sometimes people say that feminism is used as a way of putting down Islam, to sort of denigrate Islam as an anti-feminist religion and so on. Do you think there's ever sort of some justification for that?
Well, you can probably tell from my appearance, but I call myself not just a feminist, but a black feminist. I use the word black in the political sense to talk about people who are not white, women of colour, because actually in feminism as a wider movement, women of colour, so that is women who are not white, are sorely misrepresented, which is why I do the work that I do, because I think it's about exploring the intersections between being considered other in a country that is majority white as well as being considered a woman. often in anti-racist movements, women who organise against sexism are told, well, no, you're being divisive. In feminist movements, women who organise against racism or Islamophobia are being told, oh, no, you're being divisive. And actually, it's really important for women of colour to explore our very unique understanding of what it means to be a woman in this world, which, if you're a woman who's white, sometimes you can't understand.
But what about Muslim feminists? I mean, can they help in removing this prejudice stereotype that Islam is anti-women?
Muslim feminism is part of black feminism. Muslim feminism bridges the gap in that feminist discourse, because actually I think that women who are white and middle class in feminism find it very easy to point the finger and say sexism is worse over there. And that is rooted, I think, in some latent racism on their part, because they like to pretend that Britain is more enlightened than other parts of the world. And that's just not, it's not a rigorous critique of sexism as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think on that note, we've touched on some really enormous subjects which we'll have to deal with in some future programme of analysis, I think. We've now come to the end of this one, which was focusing on honour killings and domestic violence against women around the world. So I'd like to thank my guests for taking part, and of course you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions on Islam Channel. Don't forget that you can keep up with it by following us on Twitter at the address below which you see on your screen, or by following Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.